Good evening and welcome to our new webinar entitled Central Europe, Media Freedom in Danger. ASDEL is proud to host this event and to shed light on the topic of media freedom. For those who are not familiar with the association, ASDEL, the European Association for the Defense of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedom, is a Strasbourg-based NGO whose aim is to promote and defend human rights and fundamental freedom at the local, national, and international level. Now, let's first start with a simple explanation of the concept of media freedom. Media freedom includes freedom of expression in general, as it is defined by Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Simply said, it is the right to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority. This right is a crucial element of any functional democracy. Media freedom also guarantees the protection of all other human rights. Indeed, we have many examples of instances of torture, discrimination, corruption, or abuses of power that have come to light because of the work of investigative journalists. Making the facts known to the public is often the first essential step to start redressing human rights issues and hold governments accountable. More specifically, the webinar will focus on the state of media freedom in Central Europe, and more particularly in Hungary and Poland. While terminology can change, here a distinction will be made between Eastern Europe and Central Europe to be more precise. Central Europe designates the states located here in red in the map of Europe. It's between Czech Republic and Romania. While media freedom is generally well preserved and protected throughout Europe, worrying signals of repression and violations of media freedom can be observed in a number of Central European states, including Poland and Hungary. Different forms of control and pressure on the content of the media hamper their independence and pluralism. For instance, in Hungary, independent media are subject to political, economic, and regulatory pressures. At the same time, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has built a media empire whose outlets follow his party's orders. While Poland has a diverse media landscape, the government has multiplied its attempts to change the editorial line of private media and control information on sensitive subjects. So to discuss this pressing issue, we have the honor to welcome two guest speakers that have a rich expertise on the topic. First, we have Pavel Zalai, who is a director of the EU Balkans office at Reporters Sans Frontières. Thank you, Zalai, for your presence here tonight.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak in the webinar.
That's a pleasure for us. And to further our discussion, we also invited Mai-Ting Chuang, researcher at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics and author of a very interesting policy report entitled "What are the challenges to media freedom in Eastern European countries?" Good evening, Mrs. Chuang, and thank you for your presence.
Good evening, and please call me Mai-Ting. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So now that the context is set, I can give you a rough overview of the structure of the webinar. First, we'll engage in the discussion between the two guest speakers for approximately 40 minutes before taking questions from the audience in the live chats. ASDEL has prepared specific questions for either Mr. Zalai or Mai-Ting Chuang, depending on their expertise, but of course, they are welcome to respond to any question if they feel it's necessary. In the meantime, for the people watching us, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat during our discussion, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. So now let's get started with our first question to Mai-Ting. Mai-Ting, I will ask you the first question. Why is media freedom important in a democratic system?
Okay, well, I mean, let me start. So I'm a media economist. So for economists, basically what the media represents is information. And most people get all of their information from the media. So people are not experts in everything. People cannot read everything. People get information about almost everything from different media outlets. So you asked about, why is media freedom important for democracies? So let's take a example of democratic elections, where you can basically see how the media is important basically in every step of the process. So the media would inform us, like, who are the candidates who stand for elections, what kind of policies do they have. They would obviously not just present facts, but also try to explain what is important and why. And potentially media outputs would also say, who should we vote for in their opinion. So this is the form of media endorsements. And then after the elections, after we have voted a government into power, as you have already alluded to in your introductory remarks, the media should be tasked with holding that government accountable. So did the government do what they promised to do? Did they do anything wrong? So the media should be there to reveal wrongdoing, corruption. You mentioned torture, embezzlement, all of this thing. This is the role of the media. So that's what an ideal society would do. And armed with that kind of information, voters can then decide not to vote for the candidates who didn't act on their promise, not to vote for the people who were revealed to be corrupt or inefficient. So this is, I guess, the ideal scenario, and we know from academic research that people are less informed about politics when politics are less covered in the news. And the flip side of that is knowing that politicians are also less encouraged to provide effort. So this is kind of the chain of causality, if you like, that we see both from a theoretical point of view, but also documented in the data. And of course, if the media is not free, then this information is presumably one-sided and could be biased towards, for example, one particular candidate or one particular party. And that would, of course, affect how people vote, like what kind of policies and people they support, but might also affect how likely they are to hold accountable people who have been shown to not honor their promises.
Okay, thank you. So we can say that a free press and a strong democracy are mutually reinforcing. I would like to turn to Mr. Zalai. Would you like to give your opinion on this issue, something that hasn't been mentioned?
I can be very brief. I totally agree with my thing, and we also have the habit of saying that press freedom allows us to verify the existence of all the other freedoms and rights. Democracy, elections were mentioned. We can also mention the right to health, which was very important during the recent COVID crisis. The right to life during war. That's why journalists are very important in independently covering wars, or the right to have a state which is well governed, which is not corrupt. This is very important. The fight against corruption, and we can only have all that if we have independent, verified, professionally produced information.
Okay, thank you very much. I now get to the heart of the topic with this second question. I ask it to Pavel Tsarai. Can you provide an overview of the different challenges to media freedom in Hungary and Poland, and how these experiences reflect broader trends in Central Europe?
While in Hungary and in Poland, journalists are not arbitrarily imprisoned or killed, the ruling parties have used sophisticated methods to silence independent journalism, partly inspired by Putin's textbook. There are a few such methods. The first is the transformation of the public media into propaganda machines. And while this is common for both Hungary and Poland, in Hungary, this is also combined with the broadcasting or spreading of Russian propaganda in the public media, because that suits the government of Viktor Orban. Another method concerns the private media. The governments there tried to take over the private media with political and economic maneuvers. Very common way has been to put them in economically difficult conditions, like through drying out advertisement revenues, and then make them easy to be sold to companies or oligarchs close to the ruling parties. And this was the case of the website Index in Hungary, or Polska Press, the biggest network of regional newspapers in Poland. However, there is a difference, and I will get to that a bit later. This strategy has had less success in Poland. For example, a special law designed to undermine the independence of the biggest private television, TVN, was not adopted due to various reasons. And finally, as a general method of silencing journalism, I would mention the systematic harassment of the remaining independent media. And there are various ways through which this is done: discreditation campaigns, state pressures. We now have in Hungary, and this is new initiative, a sovereignty law that is in the parliament to be adopted, and which potentially will threaten journalist sources, and also allow the state to harass administratively the media. In Poland, such an initiative was a so-called Commission on Russian Influence, which was created before the election. Another way to systematically harass media are attempts on sources. And again, I will mention Hungary, which is one of the few countries where spyware was used against journalists in the EU. The Pegasus spyware, very powerful ones. And we really have to take into account that secrecy of journalistic sources is a cornerstone of press freedom. One other such way are regulatory pressures, the way the media are licensed, or the way that the licenses are denied to media. This is common. This happened in Hungary, but there have been also some issues in Poland. Also, judicial pressures, including abusive lawsuits to silence journalists, and finally, restricted access of the remaining independent media to information. So they have trouble getting replies to their questions from the government, in general, getting public information from the authorities, and the government politicians boycott them. So they don't accept invitations to their programs. But here I want to get to an important point, which I kind of sketched out already. There's a difference in the extent to which press freedom was undermined in Hungary and in Poland, as shown by our World Press Freedom Index. So in that index, out of 180 countries, Hungary is 72nd, lower than Poland. And we declared Viktor Orban in 2021 a press freedom predator because of these very powerful, sophisticated methods. 80% of media landscape in Hungary is controlled by his party, Fidesz. Poland, on the other hand, is 57th and has very strong independent media in every market segment. And one reason is that the ruling party, Law and Justice in Poland, does not have a political monopoly on power, which was also clearly demonstrated in the recent election, which in fact ended the rule of law and justice, and we can now expect the arrival of government composed of former opposition parties.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mrs. Wong, you also mentioned the challenges faced by Hungary and Poland in your policy reports. Could you pick up on what Pavel Salai has just said and develop the key drivers or factors contributing to the decline in media freedom in Central Europe?
Okay. Well, I think there are key drivers. I mean, let me focus on like the economics of this, and then I think there are key drivers that drive the decline in, or that challenge media freedom, not just in Central Europe, but basically across the world. And that key driver is there is an overall decline in the profitability of the news media. There's like a huge fall in how much advertising revenue newspapers or traditional news media organizations can get because of the entry of big tech and the internet. And this means that media outlets become vulnerable, even media outlets that don't want to be, what we call captured by the governments, they become vulnerable to things like state advertising. State advertising becomes very, very important to them because they do not have many other sources of revenue. And Pavel mentioned the example of Hungary, and I actually know a colleague of mine has written an economics paper on this, which shows that the documents evidence of a favor exchange in Hungary. So state-owned firms advertised more with news outlets that were more in line with Orban's government, and in return, they covered corruption scandals of the government less. And they've also found some suggestive evidence that this is not just the case in Hungary, but also in other places. I think it's really important thinking systematically, what are the rules or what are the laws that govern state advertising? And for many countries, those are not clear. And this means you have huge leverage over media companies that might otherwise be struggling to survive. Another driver of maybe that's more specific to Central and Eastern Europe comes back to like the history and the transition. So media outlets during the economic transition from communism, as other state-owned enterprises were sold off, were privatized, and a lot of the former state-owned media outlets that were mostly used for propaganda then were bought by Western European buyers. And those Western European buyers exited the market largely during the financial crisis, partly again because news media has become much less profitable, and those have now been bought up, or many of them have been bought up by domestic business people who may or may not have closer ties to the government. So in the Hungarian case, I think there's been several documented examples of people close to Orban buying up large amounts of the media market. I think in Poland, there is also a state-owned like oil and gas company that just bought a lot of regional newspapers from like their former German owner. And maybe this was one of the vulnerabilities, because they had so much foreign ownership. Maybe foreign owners were more interested in profits rather than intrinsically sort of linked to the country. Maybe they had fewer local ties, and maybe they were able to pull out earlier. And obviously the people that they sold it to, they might have other business interests other than just the profitability of the media outlet that they were buying. And I think another part, maybe also sort of historical, is again, both of you mentioned public service media. I think in a lot of Western European countries, we have a very long history of trusted public service media that people trust, that people read, that people believe in. And this might have been less important in many Central and Eastern European countries. And again, there's a lack of clear regulation that ensures that these public service media are independent of the government. And as you said, in the case of Poland, I mean, we can basically say that they do not seem to be independent of the government. And maybe also from the population size, maybe there's less of an expectation that the public service media will be unbiased.
Thank you, Martin. Pavel, do you want to add something about those factors that threaten media freedom in Central Europe?
No, it's fine. I can touch upon it when I answer your further questions.
Okay, well, thank you all. I believe we have a good overview now of the media situation in Central Europe and specifically in Hungary and Poland. My next two questions will focus on possible solutions to these issues. And the first one will focus on international organizations' role. Pavel, what role does the European Union and other international organizations play in addressing media freedom concerns in Central Europe?
So we can say, we can make 2 points here. The first is that the European Union is decisively the most powerful international actor when it comes to press freedom in Europe. And the other point we can make is that even the reaction of the EU is insufficient and slow. So what I'm speaking precisely about, EU has several ways it can act and in which it's acting. The first is infringement procedures. So there is European law, which also in part regulates the media and regulates the media regulators, the bodies of the states which are supposed to enforce pluralism, independence, honesty of information on the national level. And when the states, through their regulators, fail to respect the European law, part of which is independence of these regulators, the EU can file complaints. I mean, the European Commission can file complaints. This is one stage in the infringement procedure against the states in the before the Court of Justice of the EU. But there are previous stages in which the pressure on the state steps up. And so, for example, in Hungary, such an infringement procedure, which indeed ended up with a complaint before the court of the EU, was the case of Club Radio, which was an independent radio whose license was withdrawn by the Hungarian national regulator, which itself is not independent, but is really under the influence of the ruling party. And that license, that decision was really disproportional and based on was under the pretext of very banal reasons, which don't amount to such a harsh sanction as withdrawing a license. Also, we could see infringement procedures related to the independence of the Polish justice system. So the justice system, of course, is very important for press freedom and for safety of journalists. And I think EU made some progress in making Poland sort of step back from some of the reforms, although other reforms of the justice system were made. And so this was by indirect impact. Another way the EU can act and acts are the rule of law reports. So this is more public criticism. it's not really very strong measure. It's more about putting the pressure publicly on the state. So every year the EU publishes reports on the rule of law on 4 areas, including freedom of expression. There is a very strong way in which the EU does act, which is the conditionality of the EU funds on rule of law principles, and the EU funds, including the recovery fund, which was put to the table in the wake of the COVID crisis. And here, like maybe you know that a lot of money from the EU was held back for Hungary because of concerns about its democracy. But again, this is indirect because press freedom is not, unfortunately, part of these principles of rule of law. However strange it sounds, but this is the way it was decided, and we as RSF advocated for it to be included. Unfortunately, it was not. I will mention briefly two more ways of action of the EU. So there is the draft European Media Freedom Act, which is the first comprehensive EU legislation on media freedom, which will set the same rules across the continent for press freedom. It includes very important articles on public media independence, on transparent and fair distribution of advertisement, mentioned by Maiting, or on protection of sources. So now it's in the final stage of negotiation. And finally, one way in which EU acts is setting the rules for digital platforms. So by digital platforms, I mean social networks and search engines. So everything from Facebook, X to Google. And why do I mention this? Because in reality, in today's world, it's not Viktor Orban or Kaczynski in Poland who set the worldwide rules or the European rules for the media. It's the digital platforms, the way they undermine economic sustainability of the media, and the way they decide about which information we see on our screen. So EU has been legislating in this area, and very slowly, insufficiently, but making some progress in giving an advantage to the media in this informational chaos that we can see on the internet.
Okay, that is very interesting. You didn't talk about other international organizations. Would you say their influence on the matter is like not worthless?
Yeah. Of course, there is the Council of Europe, and we as RSF have a very important role to play there, but it has much softer instruments. There is also the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which goes beyond the countries that we discuss, further to the east. But again, it's not. It's much, I would say, weaker, because and I don't even talk about the UN in Europe, because really the unique feature of the EU is that the EU law is superior to the national law, and states gave up some of their sovereignty to the EU. To the benefit of the EU, of the European sovereignty. So we have courts in the EU, but also on the national level, which apply the EU law. And we have European Commission, which represents the European public interest and which doesn't represent a specific state or a specific economic group. So this is very important, and this is why our hope, and the hope of many European journalists is with the EU, and this is why we, as RSF, make a lot of proposals to the EU, and we cooperate with the EU in this area.
I see. Thank you for this clarification. On a different scale, how can civil society, journalists, and concerned citizens within Central Europe actively promote and protect media freedom?
Well, I think everybody has a role to play. You know, I recently saw a speech by Maria Ressa, the Philippine journalist who got the Nobel Prize as a first person for her journalistic work, Nobel Prize for Peace. And she said that democracy dies by 1,000 cuts, and we all have to act on our individual level. I can also mention what we as a worldwide NGO do. Our modes of action. The first is naming and shaming. This is very important. You know, we can have impact on the reputation of governments, and that's why we denounce publicly press freedom violations. We also have the World Press Freedom Index, which is published every year in April or May, and which is very closely followed by both democratic and non-democratic governments. And you would be surprised what all kinds of reactions we get when we publish it. We get letters, and we get public critique from governments. They try to discredit us. Some other democratic governments usually they have also some positive comments. But anyways, it has always a lot of reactions. Another mode of action that we as NGO use, which is very important, is proposing specific measures to improve things. So, for example, before the elections in Hungary last year and this year in Poland, we published very specific recommendations. Because when you criticize someone, you also have to say how they should do it. So we really put a lot of energy into designing tailor-made recommendations for countries. And the same goes for the EU. So we have been very active in making proposals for improvement of the European Media Freedom Act as it was negotiated. For example, in relation to the protection of journalistic sources, there is still a very big debate ongoing. There is a risk that the article will not be strong enough. We also, another mode of action that we have is specific help to concrete journalists. So, for example, in Poland, we supported financially the investigative journalist Tomasz Piatek. And finally, the last mode of action I would mention is our support, systemic support to ethical journalism as it faces unfair competition from propaganda outlets or fake news on the digital platforms that I mentioned. And for this effort, we developed an initiative. It's called the Journalism Trust Initiative. It's a kind of label for media which respect journalistic standards. And it is aimed to reward them. If there are questions, I can explain it better. But what's really important that it's a label for the media, but it's meant to be a benchmark for media regulators, for advertisers, when they have to decide where they advertise, if they want to find a media which respects journalistic ethics. And right now, the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is an international standard, is part of the European legislation. So, including the draft European Media Freedom Act. So I'll stop here.
Thank you.
And may I add, as a researcher, I very much appreciate RSF's efforts in terms of making the data available and like having a set methodology. And the World Press Freedom Index is a very valuable tool for us as researchers.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for this answer. My last question will enable us to open up the discussion to a wider part of Europe, and I address it to both of you. So first, Martin, you can start. Media freedom is a topic of global concern, and it's not limited to Central Europe. How can the experiences in Hungary and Poland serve as a reflection of broader media freedom challenges within Western democracies, like France, for example? And what lessons can be learned or shared between these regions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, the problem of declining profitability is something that is a global phenomenon. And in a way, in more Western established democratic countries, you have two things that work in your favor, which is one is it tends to be a bigger market to begin with, or people are richer to begin with. And the second, that there is more of a tradition and maybe more of a tradition of like trust in specific media outlets like the public service media. But I mean, I think as Pavel mentioned, one thing that will be very important will be looking at whether countries can come up with some sort of revenue sharing arrangement with digital platforms. So this is something that Australia has managed to do. Canada has proposed a law which has ended up with a news ban on Facebook and Google. I mean, we will see what happens there, but I personally, I think this will be part of the solution, or this has to be part of the solution. Just we have to get the money somewhere, and this is now speaking as an economist. And this is also going further to, in a sense, I think in Western democracies, we take public service media for granted. And sometimes we forget about that public service media also needs money. And there's been, in many, many countries, there's been a row about the funding of public service media. And I think France just changed how public service media in France is funded, like away from licensing to like some sort of tax-based revenue funding. And again, we need to make sure that well, first of all, we need to make sure that we think carefully about what it means to defund public service media, like what it means to defund media that has a long history of being independent and unbiased, and that has spent decades building up this kind of reputation, this kind of trust with the citizens. And now we're saying we no longer want to pay for it, and we're coming up with alternative proposals for paying for these. And we need to make sure that these alternative proposals of paying for it are not going to end up like in Hungary, where you can tie state advertising to coverage. This is something that we need to pay attention to. The other thing is, and again, part of this comes back again to not having enough money, is that we see more and more that there's a concentration of ownership in media outlets. So we know that lots and lots of newspapers, for example, have gone bankrupt, have exited the market, but even the ones that remain are now often owned by the same company. And that's potentially problematic, because that potentially also means that we're going to have a less diversity in views, and having diverse views is important again for the public discourse. And then going back to, I guess, our own role, I think it's, again, with social media, with internet searches, we have sort of gotten used to not paying for information. We have gotten used to not paying for news, and it's important to remember that didn't used to be the case, and maybe it shouldn't be the case, right? So it's, again, we should value trusted information. We should value the editorial services that media provides. Like, most of the news that you see on social media, on the internet, they come from newspapers, they come from traditional media outlets. and we don't kind of appreciate that because we don't pay for them on the internet, but someone somewhere did the work and they need to get paid, and we need to kind of show that we value that, both by paying for it, for example by subscribing, but also maybe more importantly by our attention, like by actually reading the news or going on the news, because advertising revenue on the internet, that follows attention, that follows, where you click.
Thank you very much, Mai-Ching. Laura, what's your view on this question?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I will mention a few areas, and some of those will overlap with what Mai-Ching said, including actually media concentration. So we don't think that media concentration is always a bad thing, because we really have to realize that now the media, what we call traditional media, audiovisual media, newspapers, which have also websites, etc., they compete with the social networks and platforms, which took away a lot of the advertisement. So, it's a very unfair competition, and sometimes media are merged, or companies merge, to better face these giants, who have sometimes bigger revenues than certain states in the world. So what's really problematic if the media are concentrated in the hands of oligarchs, which have other interests than other stakes in regulated industries than in the media. And so what we can learn from the situation in Hungary, in Poland, and also in France, I mean, it's very, very obvious with the group owned by Bolloré, Vincent Bolloré, that we need not only strong public media in this very volatile market, but we also need guarantees of independence for the private media. And there are such guarantees in the draft European Media Freedom Act, which I mentioned, and they can be further developed in the national legislations. So this is about the media concentration. We can learn a lesson from the huge media polarization. Media polarization is present across the world. It's harder and harder in our democracies for us to speak with people with different political views, and it's harder for media. It seems like a challenge to have a pluralistic information and opinions. But it's really important, and this is what also our Journalism Trust initiative encourages, is to keep pluralism in the media, because otherwise it's easier for governments like the one that is in Hungary or the one that was in Poland to undermine press freedom, because it's always a pretext for oppressive measures against media. They will say, and I heard this in the meetings with the representatives of both governments, those opposition media, they don't respect our views, so we have to have our own media. We have to control the public media. So it's a vicious circle. Another area where lessons can be shared and learned are again the challenges posed by the platforms, digital platforms, social networks, search engines. We need to deal with these challenges because again, otherwise politicians will use them against media, and that will further aggravate destructive effects on journalism. On Facebook or X, politicians think they don't need media anymore. Thanks to these platforms, they just put their statement there. It's spread thanks to their bubble, thanks to their supporters, and any critique, comes late or is marginalized. So and politicians, they adapt their statements to the aggressivity and to the hate that is common for the discourse on social networks. And here I think really Journalism Trust Initiative has a role to play as an international standard to be integrated into the regulation of the platforms. And now just quickly 2 points. One on solidarity of the media. So really what we can see in France, it's very common, is that when there is a press freedom violation, when there is an attack on journalists, on their sources, there is a very strong solidarity of other journalists, of our other media. And this is total lacking in Hungary. It's a very fragmented media landscape, even on the independent side, and it's only emerging in Poland. And fortunately, it seems we will not have anymore there a government which uses this fragile point of the media landscape, but it could have been otherwise. And finally, beyond that, we think media have to cooperate to tackle the new technological challenges like artificial intelligence. And this is why RSF and 16 of its partners unveiled last month the Paris Charter on Artificial Intelligence and Journalism, together with Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who I mentioned. So this is a charter that puts in 10 points, specific points, ethics before a technological progress, and puts human in the center of decision making about content generated by artificial intelligence. And we also launched a project which will produce an AI instrument for the media, because today the media depend on these big technological companies for the AI. So this is the way to empower media and to provide reliable information to citizens.
Thank you very much, you two, for these insightful answers. Now it's time for the public to ask their questions. I see we already have some, but feel free to ask new questions. Our guest will be really happy to answer them. So first I have this question from GM Kwashi. Given the various obstacles to media freedom, economic factors, are the EU regulations broad enough to protect media freedom in all situations? Issue of transparency, issue of spyware, etc. If one of you wants to answer this one.
Well, I can answer. No, currently they are not broad enough, and this is why we really need the European Media Freedom Act, which actually does cover all these areas mentioned, transparency. I don't know what's meant exactly by transparency, but it will bring more transparency about media ownership, about media funding, about distribution of advertisement. Also, one article is exactly about the use of spyware, and it's a reflection of what happened in Hungary, but also in countries like Greece, use of spyware against journalists. Really, this is the last actually obstacle to the adoption of the law, European law, because the member states insist on having their a mention of national interest. So they want to be able to use spyware to defend the state interest. And we and other organizations find that this formulation is potentially dangerous, and we need to have their guarantees that spyware will not be abused to reveal journalistic sources, as it was the case in Greece or in Hungary. So the European Media Freedom Act will be a big leap forward and we'll set the same standards in every EU country for press freedom. And it will be basically a big bang, and we still at RSA we have to take time actually to evaluate the whole impact, because it's so vast and it's still being negotiated, as I said.
Okay. We have another question from Jadmon Masson. I think this one is quite close from the last question I asked you, but maybe you have something to add about that. Considering that limitations of media freedom go beyond torturing journalists, can't we consider that media freedom is in danger also in European democracies such as France, Germany, Spain? You explain what reflection we could have with the example of Hungary and Poland. Would you say that media freedom in these Western democracies are in danger? One of you?
I think it's always, in a way, in danger is a broad sort of catch-all term. So I think, yes, I would say so. In the sense that, the current model, as we said, from the economic factors, it's hard to see that kind of going away. We're not going to return to a place where we can afford or we are willing to pay for apparently pluralistic, diverse media outlets that have diverse views. And what I think is possibly less problematic, I think maybe in Germany and France, is that you do have very strong legal protections that might be more lacking in some of the Central European countries.
Okay, thank you. We have a last question from the chat. Could you tell us what is the threat level against women journalists in Central Europe? Pavel, maybe you want to answer that?
Yeah, female journalists are especially threatened, and one of the big threats for journalists in general is the online hate, online harassment, online attacks, and they target specifically and in a especially brutal way female journalists. And this is really what we can see also in Western European countries, to partly respond also to the previous question, like France, Germany, Italy, the countries that are ranked very high in our World Press Freedom Index, Scandinavian countries. It's often women who cover issues related to equality of women in the society or gender issues. And again, this is the journalists who cover these very important issues that are in the public debate are attacked because they cover them by extremist groups, often by extreme right groups. We published a few years ago a report on women journalists, where we made very specific recommendations, also related to their work, to their workplace, to discrimination in their workplace, because they still do suffer discrimination as in other jobs as women. There have been several affairs in France, in Denmark, where women, it turned out that women were harassed in their workplace, journalists. So this is, I would say, really a worldwide phenomenon, which is also very present in Europe, although it's the safest continent for journalists. And I have to say as well, it was a woman journalist who was killed in Europe, Daphne Caruana Galizia, in 2017, and whose murder is still not resolved. And in Slovakia, a journalist man was killed, Jan Kuciak, in 2018, together with his fiancée, a woman. So she paid for his work. So this was also kind of unique situation.
Okay. Mighty, would you like to share your point of view on this question?
I think I don't have anything specific to say, but none of what Pavel has mentioned against the threats against women and against women journalists surprised me, especially not the behavior of online trolls.
Thank you. That was a really good question from Marie-Françoise Kouachi. I think since we don't have any more questions, we can make a small conclusion to this webinar. In light of the challenges we've discussed in Hungary, Poland, and their potential relevance to other countries, what are for you the key takeaways or recommendations you would give to the auditors? And maybe Martin can start.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the last part of your question.
I just wanted to know your key takeaways for safeguarding media freedom in Central Europe democracies, and what can individuals, institutions do to support a free and independent media? Your takeaways on what we discussed during an hour.
Okay, well, media freedom is very important. It's very important for democracy. I think democratic backsliding very often comes hand in hand with restrictions on media freedom, and probably without restrictions on media freedom, you would see less democratic backsliding. I think we need systemic changes. So we need systemic ways of improving the funding situation of private media outlets. We need legal safeguards for public service media, or rethinking the independence of public service media. As this is for governments, we as voters have some say in that. I think as individuals, I think again, sort of rethinking our relationship to the news that we consume, both online and offline, and more importantly, thinking about the online news, like where it comes from, and what value we want to place on it individually. Maybe you want to subscribe to a newspaper instead of just reading the blog on Google as an individual. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you. What are yours, Pavel?
Mm-hmm. So I'll make two points. One about economics and technology, another one about the geography. And I think in some ways this is maybe something I and my team can agree on. So economics really matters. It matters in countries which are democratic, as well as in those which have authoritarian politicians, like Hungary or currently Slovakia. And it's really important. It really makes a difference if there are subscription models that are functioning in countries, for example, Slovakia, also Poland, and where really media can count on relatively stable revenue from the readers, and they don't depend on subsidies and crowdfunding or external sources which are volatile. And maybe also short term. And this is related to the technological challenges. So now, in addition to social networks, we have AI, which also undermines the economic model of the media, and they have to adapt. So we really have to cooperate, and journalists and media have to cooperate to face these economic and technological challenges. On the geography, I think it's really important not to see Europe as two blocks, East and West. And I liked how you made a distinction between Central Europe and Eastern Europe, Luca. We in our WordPress Freedom Index, we have some Central European countries ranked higher than some what we call Western European countries. In Italy, which was mentioned, organized crime is a big problem. It's not such a problem in the Baltic countries, for example, which are ranked high. And we can also find other examples like that. And another, remark on geography is that when we have this European legislation that I mentioned, European Media Freedom Act, adopted, EU has really a chance of becoming a kind of legal role model in the world in the way it protects press freedom. So we're really fighting hard at RSF for this. And in the past, it was the US which was famous for its protection of freedom of expression. But now we see all these new challenges which make us think in a new way about the freedom of expression, and how best to promote trustworthy information rather than just any information. And so really EU has a chance of becoming a pioneer worldwide in this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pavel. Thank you very much, Maiting, for this insightful conversation. I speak for all by saying that we learned a lot today about the topic of media freedom. Thank you for that. And thank you to everyone in the live that listened to us tonight. That was really good to have your questions at the end, and I think you enjoyed that moment. Don't forget to follow our social media so we can keep you updated for next ASADELS events. And for now, I wish you all a very pleasant evening. And if none of you wants to add anything, I think we're done here. So I think
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.